Welcome everyone to this RISE online presentation series. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to Caine, who's the chair for the session.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening everyone, and welcome to the first of this RISE programme online presentation series, which focuses on learning inequalities Sorry, there seems to have been a short interruption there. Welcome again to the first of this RISE online presentation series, focusing on learning inequalities and social mobility. RISE, as many of you know, is a large-scale, multi-country research programme on improving education systems with the aim of delivering better learning outcomes for all. Just 1 second, I think we're having a technical problem here. We're just going to have to pause for 1 moment. Fred, are you there?
Hi, Caine. Yeah, how may I help? Are we okay? It's good to send.
I don't know if it's only at my end, but it keeps repeating. I'm going to try and close all the other windows and then start again. Right, apologies to everyone. I've just introduced the RISE programme. As many of you know, this is a large-scale, multi-country research programme on improving education systems with the aim of delivering better learning outcomes for all. I'm Caine Rolleston from University College London and a member of the RISE intellectual leadership team, as well as the Ethiopia and Vietnam teams. This online presentation series is in part a replacement for the 2020 RISE conference, and in part is a long tradition of conferences on education systems which has been held at RISE. In this panel session, we have 4 papers, and the authors have pre-recorded their presentations, which are available for you to look at on the RISE website and on the RISE YouTube channel. Each author will, however, give us a 2-minute summary of their paper before we proceed into a discussion and then invite questions from the audience. We're fortunate to have Hang from the University of Minnesota and from the RISE Vietnam team, who will present on inequalities and on ethnic minorities in Vietnam. Harounan Kazianga from the Oklahoma State University, who will present on girl-friendly schools in Burkina Faso. Janice Kim from Cambridge University, who will present on inequalities in pre-primary education in Ethiopia. And Alejandro Ganimian from New York State University on a large-scale RCT in early childhood development in India. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our first presenter, Harounan.
All right, thank you, and thank you all for coming to this session. My name is Harounan Kazianga, and I'm presenting on a joint work with Nicholas Ingwersen, Leigh Linden, Arif Mamun, Ali Protik, and Sloan. And this is a paper where we investigate the effect of girls-friendly schools, that are built to provide an overall friendlier environment for girls. And we are estimating the impact of these schools on reducing the inequality between girls and boys about 10 years after the program started. So show that the program was effective in getting girls to complete the elementary education cycle and getting more girls to transition into secondary schools. And more importantly, in terms of long-term life choices, the program reduced early marriage and childbearing. So it's important to to remember that about 10 years after the program started, the gender gap in terms of enrollment and testing costs in math and languages has closed. And the schools are still effective in promoting girls' academic outcomes, when improving the academic outcomes of girls 10 years after the programs has been in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harounan. And we are going to then go on to our second presenter. And I think that second presenter is Alejandro.
I think that's Hang's presentation.
Sorry, it's Hang Zeng going second on Vietnam.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hang Zeng, a postdoc researcher from the University of Minnesota, and I'm from the RISE Vietnam team. And with me today, my co-author, Joan DeJaeghere, and we also have other team members, Vũ Dao and Phuong Luong, who's based in Vietnam. So our research examines teachers' beliefs about and their teaching practices for ethnic minorities students to gain an in-depth understanding about inequalities in Vietnam. While Vietnam is known as a high performer in international tests like PISA, the system faced with hidden inequalities. Our study shows that ethnic minorities were regarded as incompetent in learning and that teachers' teaching practices were affected by their discriminatory beliefs. And these beliefs reflect the deficit discourse that has been long held in Vietnam and contributes to reproducing inequalities in learning. So our research is not only concerned with achieving high learning outcomes, but with equity and learning outcomes. The important implication is that teaching is more than the technical aspects of being knowledgeable about the content and teaching at the right level. Vietnamese teachers are knowledgeable and competent, but teaching for equity and high learning outcomes needs to address teachers' belief about students and their learning because this influences their practices. It is not enough to just focus on teachers' technical practice, but addressing beliefs about inequities is a large systematic issue and needs to start with teacher development. And it is related to another key takeaway that policy making should focus on equity, not just only on learning outcomes or equal access of students. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hang. And our third presenter is Alejandro.
Thank you, Caine, and thanks to everyone at the RISE conference for inviting me to present. I'm an assistant professor of applied psychology and economics at New York University, and I'm presenting joint work today with Karthik Murali-Dharan from UC San Diego and Chris Walters from UC Berkeley. So just to set the context for the study, our study is focusing on the Integrated Child Development Services, which is the largest early childhood care program in the world. It serves about 36 million children. In this system, we have Anganwadi centers, which are equivalent to a preschool center. But the main difference is that there's two workers, a worker and a helper. And the worker is responsible for a range of responsibilities, going not only from preschool education, but also through health and nutrition. So what we did is we asked ourselves whether hiring an additional worker that was exclusively devoted to preschool education could both expand time to devote to preschool education and also free up the time of a main worker to conduct her other health and nutrition responsibilities more adequately. that's exactly what we find. So let me just walk you through the findings very quickly. So first and foremost, the program very much increased time on task for both education and health services. On the one hand, preschool instruction time doubled in treated centers from 38 minutes on average to about 76 minutes on average. Secondly, as we expected, the main worker was able to devote more time to health and nutrition tasks. In fact, the time, even though was relatively small, tripled during the intervention period, as we would expect, given the increase in time on task for education, learning outcomes improved. So we conducted both tests at the centers just to see what the effect would be on the kids who attended the centers for the full 16 months of the treatment, and also in their households to understand the intent to treat or the effect of the offer of the program. So we found larger and positive effects across math, language, and executive function in the AWC or the center tests. And we also found positive, but of course, smaller effects in the household tests. Importantly, we also found that given that we freed up this time for the main worker to devote more time to nutrition and health, we also found positive impacts on nutritional outcomes. So we found a 0.1 standard deviation effect on weight for age Z-scores and a 0.09 standard deviation effect on height for age Z-scores. We use the impacts on the household test to calculate the social return on the investment of the interventions, which is nearly 12 times its cost, which is quite large. We also in the paper have a comparison in terms of the impact of the standard deviation on learning outcomes. But given that there are fewer studies in early childhood education, this might be a better benchmark for everyone. So together, we are concluding that these findings are suggesting that hiring this extra local worker is a very cost-effective strategy to increase both instructional time and to improve early learning outcomes in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Before we go to our fourth presenter, Janice, we'll just give an opportunity to Harounan to briefly recap because his presentation couldn't be heard very well with an audio problem. Are you there now, Harounan?
Yes, I'm
great.
Here.
Great, thank you. Do go ahead.
Oh, okay, good. You want me to start over? Do you want me to start over?
Yes, you can just briefly summarize because I think a lot of what you said couldn't be heard.
Okay, I'm sorry. So what I said that our paper was is estimating the impact of a girl-friendly school. What we call girl-friendly school here as a new school that are built to provide an overall environment that is friendlier for girls learning. That include providing separate latrine for boys and girls, hiring more female teachers, for example, and providing extra tutoring for girls. So 10 years after the program has been in place, we went back and reevaluate the impact on two series of outcomes. The academic outcomes for girls who are exposed to these programs as children, and the impact of on their life choices in the long term, because these girls are now adolescents and young adults. We find that the programs increased the completion of primary school for these girls and the transition into secondary school, that in terms of academic outcomes. In terms of life choices, the program reduced early marriage by up to 12% and delayed early childbearing by up to 9%. In addition, the schools that were built about 10 years ago are still effective in increasing the academic outcomes of younger girls who are still going through the elementary school stage. These are the main takeaway, and one of the key outcomes of the program is reducing the gender gap, right, in a relatively short period of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harounan. And now we go to our fourth presenter, Janice Kim.
Okay.
Thank you, Caine, and everyone joining the RISE online session. My name is Janice Kim, Research Associate at the Real Center at the University of Cambridge. I will present a work on behalf of Polly Rose, Sakrositur, Leigh Hagos, and Tazul Dehana and Tirusu Tafara from RISE Ethiopia team. So our research evaluated a large-scale expansion of pre-primary education in Ethiopia, focusing on whether the reform reduced or reinforced inequalities in education. So Ethiopia has been experiencing the rapid and extensive policy reform since 2010. With the government-led reform, enrollments in pre-primary increased from 5% in 2010 to 50% in 2016, which now serve 2.6 million children. However, when we looked at closely enrollment trends by subgroups, inequalities in early learning opportunities have persisted. There are huge regional disparities in access and problems with underage enrollments, which could worsen the supply side constraints and also quality of services. When we compare determinants of preschool attendance before and after the reform, family characteristics such as parental literacy, home learning environments, and urban-rural location remain as a powerful predictor of preschool attendance, even after the expansion. And in terms of the relationship between preschool attendance and early grade reading in primary school, there is a strong relationship in the post-reform period, but not in the pre-reform period. Given that there was a significant improvements in adult literacy and country's economic growth between 2010 and 16, it is likely that the beneficiaries of economic growth in Ethiopia are likely to be the beneficiaries of preschool reform. So those who remained with the most disadvantaged background were more likely to have been left behind from the reform, which is not aligned with the government ambitions to the proper expansion of preschool. Policy implications of this study is to reduce barriers to preschools for the poorest children with more targeted approach. Financial commitment, targeted resourcing, and also capacity building for policy actors at the different levels are critical to expand preschool access equitably. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janice, and to all the presenters. And we have now already got some questions coming in online from our participants. But before we go to those, I want to raise a few questions for all the panelists about some common themes in relation to inequality and social mobility that all their papers address, and get their comments and discussion points for all of us. So first of all, could I ask you, in preparing your work and your presentation, do you think that there are trade-offs or difficulties that organizations, governments, providers of interventions face in providing for both improving standards in education and for reducing inequalities? I'm thinking, for example, in the case of Vietnam, that ethnic minority students there perform well compared to disadvantaged groups in some other countries, but there are still large gaps between ethnic minorities and the kin majority. And some of the policies of the Vietnamese government are essentially policies which do not specifically discriminate between groups, but which may have the effect of homogenizing and not recognizing difference. But is there a risk that without doing that, you could actually make the situation worse? Now, this may apply to all your countries, but perhaps we could let Hang start.
Thank you, Caine. Yeah, I think the issue related to reducing gaps versus raising standards is very interesting, though I myself may not see these two aims as mutually exclusive. So, you know, like many other developing countries, Vietnam has focused significantly on raising standards. For example, improving people's living standards, raising teachers' quality standards, increasing enrollment rates and equal access, etc. So I think these policies are good because they help raise the overall quality, at least through an increasing quantity, right? For example, over the past decades, Vietnam has seen an increase in gross enrollment rates, and is often characterized as a high performer as measured on both national or international tests like PISA. But the question is, Students from disadvantaged groups like ethnic minorities are well represented in this test? The answer is not, right? So in order to tackle persistent inequalities in long term, I see policy priorities now should be addressing long-held cultural misperceptions and legitimizing social differences and diversity.
There's no risk, you think, Hang, of setting different standards for different groups which could accentuate inequalities? Is there not an element of the socialist system in Vietnam which has set the same standards for all groups and tried to provide additional resources where they're needed?
So you mean imposing standards for all groups?
Well,
Is that what you mean?
It's certainly a negative thing that culturally there could be not enough recognition of difference in Vietnam. But if you recognize difference to the extent that you then allow standards to differ, you can end up in a situation where policies lead to larger inequalities.
Yes, I think so. But it is really a challenge in Vietnam because the education system is a centralized system informed largely by state socialism. So I think that legitimizing diversity and valuing social differences is really policy priorities in the current time.
And just finally on that though, is there not some risk in going away from that centralization towards decentralization that you could end up having a bigger range of standards, a bigger range of outcomes, rather than raising standards for all?
But in that sense, can you clarify kind of the different kinds of standards that you mean? Because in Vietnam,
let's let one of the others come in, but there's a risk that the opposite of centralization is that you have a flourishing of difference, but then you potentially also have a widening of inequalities. But maybe someone else would like to comment on that. Alejandro, do you have anything on your sample?
Sure, let me unmute myself. So I'm going to speak about the Indian context, which is the one that I know best and the one that most applies to our study, of course. But I do think that some of the lessons are more generalizable. So I don't know that we should frame this debate as raising standards versus addressing gaps. So I think it's now quite well documented that there's enormous heterogeneity in students' preparation for learning in the Indian school system. Excuse me. Many children lag behind curricular standards. Their achievement on any given grade level spans several grades, and children progress much slower than the curriculum would expect. So to the best of our knowledge, this heterogeneity starts very early. It continues and widens during primary school, and it persists even in middle school after many of those children have actually dropped out of school, right? So if low school readiness is limiting children's capacity to take advantage of a primary school education, I think we can improve equity by improving school readiness head on. And that is what we've tried to do in our intervention, of course, right? But I wouldn't say that this is likely to take care of persisting learning gaps by student characteristics such as income, sex, geography, etc. So there's copious sort of studies on these issues by Rima, Leigh, Jen, Karthik, Abhijit, on sort of both sex differences in schooling attainment and learning outcomes, and also in how different teachers treat different groups of students, particularly students from different castes in India, differently, right? So I think these are different problems, even if they're both related to the general problem of equity, and I think they deserve separate attention.
Right, and so I mean, you're referring there to differences between schools and differences between backgrounds as two distinct sources of inequality. And the school difference is the one, of course, that policy is most likely to affect. And have you seen that in your study? That is there a prospect to reduce inequalities in the inputs that schools make by the kinds of interventions that you've worked on?
Differences in inputs in schools. I mean, I'm not sure about that. I think what I can tell you is currently there's a large debate in India about whether the best way to improve school readiness especially for children from low-income families is to strengthen ICDS, which is, as I said before, the Integrated Child Development Services, which is the system that I've described, or whether it's better to actually add, say, a preschool classroom to a primary school, right? And I think there's ongoing work being done by Karthik Royalajaran, one of my co-authors, and Abhijit Singh and Mauricio Romero on that second alternative. And I think it's not a clear question. It's something that is sort of empirical to be answered. But I do think that sort of this approach, at the very least, seems to do a lot with very few resources, right? So just to clarify, because I didn't get to say it in my presentation, ECC facilitator salary is about half of that of a worker. So, you know, with hiring someone who is local, who meets the same conditions as a worker, you can radically transform the learning outcomes of these children. And quite surprisingly, to me at least, the nutritional outcomes too, right? So I'm not sure whether it's a task of schools or ICDS, but currently we're evaluating both approaches and seeing which one is most promising, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Now, Janice, some of these issues also face the government in Ethiopia, which is rolling out large-scale ECDS for children who haven't previously been able to access preschooling. And clearly there is a big difficulty in ensuring adequate quality on such a large scale. Does anything that Alejandro has to say resonate with you in Ethiopian context?
Okay. So, yeah, I think one of the issue of like large scale expansion in Ethiopia just face like this quality issues, like low quality expansion of like low quality like preschools. Then the other, and then like governments introduced like a school grants for O class, which is pre-primary classes in Ethiopia. But this applies to like all schools in Ethiopia, which has the O class. Then I think that intends to like school inputs that have to school inputs designed to like improve the school quality, but that school grants is only eligible for the schools with O class, which have a more resource, and then the schools without O class, which don't have the resource to like establish O class, they cannot receive any resources. So I think that's like inequalities in like learning. The qualities issues like that supported by governments, also related to that the policy approach, that how it's pro-poor approach, that like because it should be prioritized the school with lack of resource instead of school which already have some resources. So I think that's.
Are you suggesting that it's actually the wrong way around in Ethiopia, that the focus on providing grants to schools which already have resources could be against equity and worsen inequality?
So I think, yeah, that's the only one issue that are facing the governments, that because that allocation of the school grants is not proposed, then I think that's they can be also like exacerbate like inequalities in school quality and also like learning access. So I think that's the one thing they face, the Ethiopian governments face in improving early learning opportunities and also school qualities in preschool.
Thank you. And I think we could move to another question, a related question about the sources of inequality. So some kinds of inequality are caused by differences in inputs. Sometimes they are particularly unjust if they are related to discrimination. And in the case of Burkina Faso, Harounan, would you say that the kinds of inequalities that you were addressing there were associated with discrimination specifically?
Yes, to some extent that that parents in many areas of the world, but specifically in some contexts in sub-Saharan Africa, have a preference of boys over girls when it's come in investment, when it's come to investment in education, for example, so that on average, more boys than girls will be enrolled in school, and when girls even get enrolled, they are more they are less likely to stay longer in school, to complete the elementary schooling system, and to transition into into secondary education. And as the children age, the opportunity cost of the time increases, and especially for girls. And in the more conservative areas, there will be an additional pressure for the girl to marry and start bearing children. So the aggregate effect is a system where, on average, you have girls will have less education than boys, and they are more likely to start to getting married earlier and raising a family earlier. And that some of the issues our program sought to was addressing.
And quite successfully, as far as I could tell from the results of your program. So do you think that some of those interventions were able directly to reduce discrimination, or they offset the discrimination by providing additional resources?
I think they offset discrimination by providing additional resources. So and some of the results I didn't get into the short key takeaway, that the program was successful in improving girls' academic outcomes without lowering boys' academic outcomes. So it's actually like if since these decisions are made at the household level, if you provide additional resources for girls within the household, since to some extent these resources are fungible. Parent, you can raise actually the academic outcomes of girls, and without deteriorating boys' academic outcomes. So in the full set of results that we present in the paper, actually in the treatment villages, the academic outcomes improves for both boys and girls, but it was increasing faster for girls. So that allowed girls to catch up with boys in the non-treatment villages.
Great. And do you think that as a result, if it is mostly about offsetting, that there could be a resurgence of the gaps later on? I mean, you've got some longer term follow-up, but do you think in the labor market, for example, that if discrimination remains, that it's not offset or not addressed, that these benefits could, in the long term, not be sustained?
It's possible that I think the program, our program was not designed to address, this type of program is not designed to address discrimination. Addressing discrimination in the labor market, et cetera, will require a different program, for example. But that's a good point, that if the short answer is that we don't know, because if it could be that discrimination remains, so that eventually you enroll girls, they finish secondary schools, and at the end, the labor market discriminates against them, then the return to investment in girls will always appear lower, smaller than that for boys, and in the long run, you still have the gap, the reemergence of a gap. So that one possible outcome. The other outcome is that just by having more girls in school, more girls completing secondary school, and more educated girls, women in the labor market, that by itself will be powerful enough to reduce discrimination over time. Right? But that just speculative, because we don't know.
Thank you very much. And I think that relates to a question for Hang in Vietnam about the issue of ethnic minorities. And part of the gap in relation to ethnic minorities is linked to discrimination at the school level, but also in terms of the curriculum, as you mentioned in your paper. But how much of it do you think is about discrimination, and how much of the policies of Vietnam need to address discrimination directly?
Yeah, I think that is one of the key questions that we ask when we research these issues as well. And as I said earlier, it is evident in our study that a majority of teachers teaching ethnic minority students had low expectation of the ethnic minority. So teacher believes that students simply couldn't achieve high levels of learning and that they were not able to think critically or creatively, often mostly because they were not as proficient or adept with the Vietnamese language, the King language. So as a result, many teachers engage in teaching practices that clearly assume that ethnic minorities are not as capable as majority students in learning. So they just attempted to provide or to fill the student with basic knowledge and skills, or to teach at just only the right level. And because we also collected achievement scores from the schools and conducted achievement tests in a related study in RISE, we were able to connect between classes with low or high learning outcomes with teachers who had differing practices for ethnic minorities and majority students. So from our studies, we can explain how inequalities in learning in Vietnam can be the result of discrimination, and both in thinking and in practices. So it is pretty clear in our research in that sense.
Thank you very much. I have a question which relates more to two of the papers than the others, but I think everyone might have a comment on methodologically in a way. So Alejandro, your study is a large-scale RCT, which in the technical language has very good external validity in the sense that it's large enough that we believe the results could be generalized to the rest of the state or even to India more generally. But of course, every RCT just tests an individual intervention and doesn't tell us the results of all the alternative interventions that might have taken place. Is there more that we could do, or do you have any comment on how the RCT approach could help us to learn why some solutions work in some contexts, or why some might be more generalizable than others, or more generally, what the problems in a particular system are? Does it help us to diagnose those blockages and rather more than just a simple technical solution?
I think it's an excellent question. So let me make a few points. The first one is that, as Karthik mentioned in the presentation that he pre-recorded, this is a sample that's representative of Tamil Nadu. We purposefully drew that sample in that fashion. So I think the generalizability to the rest of the state is sort of quite an important feature of the study itself. That's number one. Number two, I think it's important that a large-scale intervention can be tested as a demonstration effects for other states that might meet similar conditions, right? So, and I do think it's important to acknowledge this condition. So number one is that this is a system in which there's two workers, and one of those workers, the main worker, is responsible for not just education, for a host of other responsibilities. That might not be the feature of other school systems. And if that's not the feature, then you might want to try to understand whether the study generalizes to those contexts. The third condition is that you have not only an established ECC curriculum that the government of Tamil Nadu developed jointly with UNICEF, which is high quality, but also daily guidance and activities. So, by hiring a local worker with a minimal high school education, you can actually get very far in terms of instructional, both expanding instructional time and improving instructional quality, right? So I think, you have to ask yourselves, do similar contexts meet those conditions? And the more they do, the more likely these lessons are to transfer. Now, let me make sort of an additional point and an acknowledgement. There's many people logged into today's webinar that are research managers and research associates of JPAL South Asia, that is the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab. That team of stellar people worked with me since 2015 to first conduct what JPAL calls a scoping study. So a scoping study is a descriptive study, there's no intervention, in which you actually try to understand, as you put it, Caine, what is the blockage of the system? Well, interestingly, we conducted this study with across 80 Anganwadi centers in the same districts in which we conducted the interventions. We found that on average, even though workers were expected to teach for 120 minutes, they were teaching for 38 minutes, which is exactly what we found in the RCT. It blows my mind. So this is an important first step, I would say, if you're going to try something big and you're going to make a big bet on an intervention, because it allows you to verify the problem and go back to the government and just make the case for the intervention, right? And this was a perfect setting to do so because JBL South Asia didn't have a partnership just with the ICDS department, but also across multiple departments. So the government could tell, the state government could tell that we were invested in improving outcomes across different sectors. And we actually had multiple review meetings. So our research managers were meeting with the ICDS director pretty frequently. We also had monthly advisory council meetings in which the government could actually give us feedback on what was working, what was not working, whether the measurement made sense or not, whether we might want to include a district or not. And then we had less frequent meetings with a broader group. So I think number one takeaway is look at the context and see how much it compares. Number two is, to the extent that you can, do conduct a descriptive scoping study to verify that the problem is indeed as you diagnosed it before. And number three, have an army of stellar research managers and research associates that can help support that interaction with the government throughout your partnership.
Thank you very much. Maybe we could just ask Harounan to comment on that question too, because we've also had a question from the audience about your design. What is an RDD design? But also, can it help us to answer these broader questions about systems, or is it only a way to test one technical intervention?
Yeah, so the RDD design is a regression discontinuity design. So it's what we are doing is that we are comparing. Well, so let me step back. So the way the program was allocated was within departments. So to give you a background, Burkina is organized in region, provinces, departments, and then villages, right? So and villages, in eligible provinces, could apply to receive a school. And when villages applied, then the application was based on the number of girls in the village, the distance to the nearest school, etc., etc. So there was a bunch of there was a scoring system that was put in place by the Ministry of Education, and all eligible villages apply to receive the school. And within each department, the village were ranked, and the village who crossed a certain threshold within the department received the school, and the other village didn't receive the school. So what our estimation is doing is comparing villages who are just above the threshold and with villages who are just below the threshold in each department. So, and the village who crossed the threshold received the school, and the one who didn't cross the threshold didn't receive the school. And the basic idea is that if we rank, if we use the score, we normalized the score, for example, from 0 to 100, it makes sense, and 50 is the threshold. It makes sense to compare the household in the villages who received, who scored 49, who didn't receive the school, and who scored 50, who did receive the school. Right? Comparing these villages would make sense. But on the other hand, it would not make sense to compare the villages who scored, the household in the villages who scored 0 with the villages who scored 100. So that's the basic idea. So, and to what extent? And of course, again, since this is essentially comparing villages across the threshold, it's always hard. It's always hard, or it's difficult to generalize to villages who are far away from the threshold. in the paper.
So can I just interrupt because we're running short of time? Do you think you could say something about what you learned on the Burkina Faso education system from the regression discontinuity study?
Sure, there are many things we learn from the education system, but if there are more specific questions that I could address, because in doing the exercise, we looked at how teachers are located across school based on qualification and gender and experience. We learn also how the crowding of the school, the oversubscription across the schools, so and access to teacher housing, for example. So there are many aspects of the education system that that we learn, right? How far and how long students have to walk to attend the school, for example.
And these were things that were disadvantaging girls in particular, which is how you then have diagnosed this as a solution, right?
Yeah. And yes, and another aspect is the time allocated to doing household chores, right? So that usually involved more girls than boys.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have quite a few questions. I've got a couple to ask you, Hang, on Vietnam, if you don't mind. First of all, could you tell us, do you think that, for example, the Vietnamese government could or is already following a policy to recruit indigenous teachers, let's say teachers from ethnic minority groups, which could potentially help to address some of the discrimination and the disparities? That's the first question. And the second question, do you think it's realistic to imagine that professional development programs among teachers could address these kinds of issues? For example, changing teachers' beliefs.
Yeah, thank you for these wonderful questions. I think they are also recommendations that we offer in our paper. So for the first issue, recruiting teachers from indigenous or ethnic minorities groups, actually we also offer this kind of recommendation for policy making in our study. And in Vietnam, we do have this policy, but from my observation, I don't think that it works because basically it is suggested that it is reported that ethnic minority students often drops along the way when they get to higher level of education. So it is really difficult to get into teacher education programs. Of course, we do have teachers from ethnic minorities, but not many. So that is one of the key areas that we need to accelerate more in the near future. Regarding the second question, we do believe that pedagogic work should be regarded as the first and most strategic place or starting point to address social inequality in Vietnam or in other contexts as well. So I think that policy making or policy change should begin with teacher education, where teachers or educators should be encouraged to create opportunities for all students to fully engage in the teaching process, and we do think that teachers should be drawing on principles of socially inclusive principles so that they can understand and value social differences and engage in social justice. And from that, they can apply pedagogies for diversity or for equity. So I would also like to listen the experiences from other contexts as well, but that is what we know or observe from the Vietnamese context.
Thank you. I think that your co-author, Joan DeJaeghere, has a comment to add actually there. Are you there, Joan?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I'm the co-PI on the Vietnam RISE team, and also I'm helping lead this study. I just wanted to make a couple of comments in regard to the question that you posed, but in a couple of other questions that were asked. And one is that on the one hand, there is sort of policy-making work that can be done to try and address teacher development. And that's what Hung was referring to. But on the other hand, and to questions I think that were asked, there are some natural experiments as well as meaning that there are some variation that goes on within this sort of what one would call a very homogenized system, right? A centralized system. There are some variations across the regions in Vietnam where teachers, have more knowledge, experience, or hold different beliefs about ethnic minority students. And there are cases where NGOs have worked very concertedly, particularly, for example, in the North with Hmong students, as well as in the South with Khmer students. So while there is a very centralized system in Vietnam and policymaking can address some issues, I think we also have to recognize that actually it's not as centralized in some aspects of teacher practice as we would like to think it is around sort of probably political ideology. It's very centralized around political ideology and policies. It's less centralized around teacher practice. And there is quite a bit of divergence in our own data showing what teachers in the South might do and how they practice versus some teachers even in the North. So there is quite a lot of variation and sort of national experiments that we could look at in terms of how some students and some teachers in some schools are actually able to do better in their learning outcomes, and it is more equitable. And I wanted just to also comment, this is actually a qualitative study. It's the qualitative component of our larger study where we've done a large survey in 100 secondary schools, but we're doing a qualitative video analysis of teachers' practices as well as interviews with teachers. So I just wanted to clarify that part of the methodology as well.
Thank you very much, Joan. We've got a couple of questions for you, Janice, if you don't mind. The first of all is about gender differences in preschool attendance. So your study in Ethiopia found that there are gender gaps in preschool attendance, which are more significant than might have been initially expected. Do you think that that's something that will be found elsewhere as large-scale preschool programs expand?
Thanks, Caine. That's good questions, but also I want to highlight that because I explained gender gaps in the recorded sessions, but compared to regional disparities, I think a gender gap is not that severe. I think a GPI was 0.95 during the reform period. So I think it's maybe misinterpretation of our findings, but there are some level of gender disparities, but it's not severe than regional disparities. And then also I think as other countries have low level of gender disparities in early childhood or early grade in primary schools, I think it's more similar trends that even and then also I also see discussions about regions. So I think some regions have some religious or ethnicities have some more gender disparities than others. But I think on average, I think ECE has a less gender disparities in enrollments in Ethiopia.
And the largest gap is probably really between urban and rural areas more generally, right, across the country. And what would you suggest might be the kinds of policies that could help to reduce the urban-rural gap in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I think so. Government has the clear policy goals to reduce the gap between urban and rural, but how reforms rolled out is just all same measures to urban and rural areas. So I think then the learning inequalities has been exacerbated during the reform period. So now and then, but also like a school needs some like basic resources that like teachers and also like school grants for like very basic learning materials. But now governments know that which regions don't have a capacity to build up like their O-class or don't have any financial resource to like hire more EC teachers or trained teachers. So and then this is more clear needs and data that shows that like which part of the regions, which rural areas, and also like children with like parents with illiterate parents or who has the parents who never been to schools. So I think that identify the clear gap, the poorest children's, which has to be included in the like early childhood system. So I think the panel really highlights the power of like intervening early, and otherwise an initial disadvantage leads to like accumulated like disadvantage over time. So I think the governments need to. Yeah.
Would you say it's more important to intervene early in rural areas than it is in urban areas?
Sorry?
Is it more important to intervene early in rural areas where the disadvantage is greater?
Yeah, so now I haven't presented here, but I also look at the reform in Ethiopia from other perspectives. Then still like there is a gaps between inequality, the gaps between urban and rural, or advantage and disadvantage in access, but still ECE is a powerful like equalizers for like early learning gaps. So I think the more government supports and like targeted measures should be directed to like rural areas or poorest or marginalized communities.
Thank you very much, Janice. And a question for Alejandro, I think a clarification, but also an interesting question about the study. So you weren't necessarily anticipating the health outcomes that you found in the study, but can you explain those and why were they as they were? And is it something that you had expected?
Sure. So we have a pre-analysis plan for our study, which we uploaded to the American Economic Association's RCT registry. You can access it in www.socialscienceregistry.org for everyone who's watching. As we specified in the pre-analysis plan, we had considered that there might be impacts in both weight and height. So we listed those as secondary outcomes. And similarly, we tested other nutrition-focused interventions in which we listed the education outcomes as a secondary potential impact, right? So why would they happen is a great question. So when you have a single worker responsible for teaching preschool education, doing home visitations, helping with immunizations, but also every once in a while being requested to help with other responsibilities not ICDS related, just because they're a community they're linked to a community, such as helping with local elections. That you can imagine how Anganwadi workers would be overwhelmed with the amount of tasks, just if you focus on administrative tasks. These women have about 11 registers to complete with different levels of periodicity. So to me, it's not very unsurprising that the moment that you give these women a respite by hiring a worker who's exclusively devoted to preschool education, they will do whatever else they're assigned to do, such as helping with immunization, with the noon meal, and with other responsibilities related to health and nutrition. What is surprising to me is the magnitude of those impacts that we found in weight for age and height for age scores, right? So it just tells you so much about how much of a binding constraint this allocation of so many responsibilities is to the worker. And just going off on some of the questions that I received through the chat, I just wanted to clarify, this is not a new model for Tamil Nadu. So Tamil Nadu a few decades back had tried a similar two-worker model, which was funded by the World Bank. But once that additional funding ran out, the project was phased out. So both the fact that the government had prior experience with it made it more likely to take up this innovation and try it out. But also, potentially gives you a sense of the promise of this intervention in this context, right? So not so much surprised about the shifting in time, but quite pleasantly surprised about the magnitude and the effects in nutrition.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. So we're coming close to the end of our time, but just as a final question, do any of the panelists have reflections on comments that were made to them during this research by participants, by people in the countries and the studies that they conducted, more qualitative observations about inequality, things that perhaps might explain some of the phenomena that weren't necessarily obvious to them from their own design? How about you, Harounan? Do you have anything to add on that?
Yes. So in this study, we didn't in our program we didn't run a qualitative study. We just measured and looking at the comments online, there was some question whether we addressed on norm on early marriage, for example. The study didn't address didn't get into this type of didn't address norms. Right? So there was a community-run program early on and in two phases to describe the benefits and the importance of getting girls into school, of girls' education in general. And we think that this type of program combined with improving the school quality led to more girls being enrolled in school, to keeping girls longer in school, and over time that had reduced the rate of early marriage and early childbearing.
Thank you very much, Harounan. How about you, Hang? Anything to add on qualitative observations? You've done quite a lot on that. Oh, you're on mute at the moment.
Yeah, just a very brief comment. I think that our research is one of the few qualitative studies in rice, and we added to the rice secondary research in our Vietnamese team. So I think it is very interesting to see the connection between high and low performing schools in Vietnam with the practices and the belief and the practices of teachers through qualitative approach. And I see that this really makes sense for us to have this kind of methodology approach.
Thank you. And just a final comment from you, Janice and Alejandro. Janice, do you have something to add on Ethiopia?
I think the study, like diagnostic study that I present today, I think this is also and then also qualitative part, the interview with key stakeholders reveals misalignment between government's targets and resources, and also incoherence between government's objectives and local preferences and capacities. So governments have very ambitious target to expand and achieve universal preschools, but local is not prepared, or they are not informed well with even they have to delegate objectives, but they don't have a clear directions or resources or information and motivation that they can react to their reforms. So I think that's the one issues I want to highlight.
Thank you, Janice. And Alejandro, give you the very last word.
Thank you. This was super interesting. Thanks, everyone. We didn't have a qualitative component, but I would invite everyone, once the paper becomes available, to take a look at the different types of observations that we use. So we use unannounced visits to Anganwadi centers to check on attendance and punctuality for workers and the ECC facilitators. Why unannounced? Because we didn't want to prompt workers to show up earlier or to show up, period, if they weren't planning to do so just because we weren't coming to their center. That's number one. And number two is we did I worked for quite a few months with one of our RAs, Anuja Venkatachalam, on adjusting a tool that many of you might know for classroom observation, the Stallings observation system. So the Stallings observation system only tracks the share of time or instructional time that's devoted to instructional strategies versus classroom management versus being off task. So what we did is in the downtime of the Stallings, we also observed what types of activities the workers were conducting. So we actually have quite a detailed set of observations on the materials that they were using, who they were engaging, whether the two workers were working together, one of them was leading the work. So I'm sorry that I don't get to cover all of that in this presentation, but as I said, I encourage all of you to check out the paper once it becomes available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. And that leaves us all to look at the papers and the presentations because they are available online. I know that not everyone has seen them yet, but you can access them on the RISE website and on the RISE YouTube channel. So please do go there. And thank you very much for all your questions. We haven't been able to answer every single one of them, but you can, of course, find the email addresses of all the presenters in the RISE website and direct your questions further to them. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, and I hope you'll be joining the second one. That's all from us. Thanks a lot to all the presenters and to all the audience. Bye.
Thank you, Caine. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.